Michele, perhaps I can come to you first with a question to get a sense of, I guess, where you're coming from. Before you started at Sedgwick, you were over at Cushman & Wakefield, which is one of the world's largest commercial real estate organisations. So something that's very much focused around the benefits of the traditional office, the physical space. I guess as somebody who has been an advocate for physical spaces for many years, what are you seeing as the real benefits? What do we want to keep as we move towards this hybrid model? What are the kind of the real advantages of this physical space?
Yeah, thanks. So pre-pandemic, the value of the workplace was routinely just to go to work, and that's what you did. You went to the office, you sat alone, maybe in your office and you're at your desk, and you just did your work. You would meet with colleagues, you would go to lunch, but you just went to work. The pandemic has really given us the opportunity to rethink that completely and think about the purpose of place. So if I think about what is the purpose of an office, I think about four things. It's connection, it's collaboration, it's career development, and client need. So on the connection piece, it's about the physical connections that we have with one another so that we can really drive bonding to one another and bonding to the organization. Cushman & Wakefield does an experience survey, and their most recent survey they just put out. And what it says is for honeymooners, so employees who have been with an organization for less than a year, they've got high engagement. So that's the great news. What they're missing, though, is activating networks and how do they build those networks and activate them? And they're missing bond. So that leads us then to collaboration. We've all learned to collaborate. We do it all the time. We're on Zoom, we're collaborating, but it's more tactical collaboration. And what we really need to do is continue to drive collaboration that's dynamic and leads to innovation. And you do that by running into people in the halls and sparking up a conversation. So the office is great for that. With career development, I particularly worry about early in career colleagues who need mentoring and they need sponsorship, and it needs to be really intentional, and it's difficult to do when everybody's remote. And then finally, client needs. Our clients are telling us they want our colleagues back in the office when it's safe to do so that they can collaborate with them and they can build those connections and they can build that bond.
Yeah, absolutely. Michele, do you think the last 12 months has really crystallized what we all miss about being in the office?
I absolutely think that the last 12 months has crystallized that. Gartner did a study last year, and it showed that the average employee's ability to absorb change has been cut in half when compared to the previous year. And obviously, we all need to be able to absorb change because there has never been a year like this past year. And in order for us to all be productive, we need to absorb change. And workplace productivity and engagement really hinges on people managers, and it always has, but that is really brought us to a new level of people managers. And what I worry about is ensuring that our people managers have the tools that they need in order to make the workplace productive.
Yeah, it's a great point, and I think we'll pick up on that idea of the importance of the manager as we go further into this. Trina, let's maybe come to you next, if we can. You've been helping organisations to work successfully in a virtual setting for many years now. As somebody who has advocated that virtual way of working, what have you seen unfold over the course of the past year? Trina, you may be on mute there.
Yeah, it happens every time, right? Somebody has to do it in every meeting or we're not real. I agree with everything that Michele said in terms of the challenges that have shown up during the pandemic work from home environment. I don't agree that it has to all be face to face to get that connection, that sense of belonging, that true collaboration that's beyond transaction. But what I have found is that it's the desire to work virtually. People in the last year have recognized that it can be done, that connection, that sense of belonging has been lost a little bit. but it can be replaced. I know for a fact that 100% virtual organizations, 100% virtual teams connect, belong, collaborate, innovate together, but it takes a special set of intention. I'll use Michelle's word, intention, to make that happen. Managers, virtual team leaders need to help the people connect on purpose formally, which we've gotten pretty good at to get the job done, and informally to really leverage that social capital, which is key to unleash creativity, unleash collaboration, and help people get past that emotional hurdle of feeling like they're part of something bigger than them, even though they're sitting at home in office.
Yeah, absolutely. And I should probably add that I appreciate that everybody is playing a role here, and that whilst you know, Michele is arguing for the physical space and you're arguing for the virtual space, I know for a fact that you are both also advocates of this more hybrid model and recognise the pros and cons of each. But Trina, Michele mentioned there about the importance of the manager in this. You know, I guess successful virtual workspaces don't just happen. They have to be orchestrated, they have to be managed, they have to be, you know, there's some thought has to go into them. So what are you seeing the more successful firms doing over those that are maybe not seeing as much success in a virtual setting?
Great question. A couple of things that are obvious. First, the C-suite, the CEOs need to understand that what the employees want is not all that matters. It never is. It's got to be strategically relevant. The setting has to fit what the customer needs. But team desire to work virtually is really the critical differentiator, because you got a team that wants to work virtually, they can do it with Dixie Cup and string. They don't have to have all of the best tools to make it happen, because the desire, that motivation is our primary driver. What I'm finding in the workplace in recent studies is that the manager is the key differentiation between employees being connected and feeling included and belonging in the workplace as a virtual worker, compared to somebody who's bringing home a paycheck and transactionally producing work in exchange for money. And that's what we don't want. We don't want transaction. We want true connection and commitment to keep the culture going in a virtual environment. And the manager is a key. And there are 3 critical tasks that manager must lead. The first is to develop that team, especially with newer employees who are entering the workforce in a hybrid or a remote work environment. Set up that digital coach, that accountability buddy, that partner to help people onboard. Having team agreements and protocols and processes and systems that are easily tracked and followed, that are consistent across the organization enough that people coming in can tap into the processes and the way we work quickly, so that we can focus on the team and getting to know each other and connecting that way, and breaking down silos. That's another burden of virtual work, is that silo breakdown, that collaboration across departments struggles in a virtual environment if the intention is not there, connecting people to people, departments to departments, et cetera, and so on. So the first is to develop that team, get the clarity about the role, the task, their job, but also their role as a virtual or co-located or a hybrid team manager to be able to find each other when we need them and not have to use that manager as the critical connecting point. And the second critical success factor for the team leader is to support the team, create those connections, open the doors, facilitate career conversations, task force commitments. That is a manager's role now. More than managing tasks, it's managing relationships and leveraging the social capital to keep people connected and working together. And then the third critical success factor task of the manager is really to help the team deliver results and celebrate success. The celebration piece becomes automatic when we're in a room together, because we can feel the energy bouncing off the walls. We can high five each other. We can woot woot. We can have a beer. But when we're working virtually, the manager really needs to intentionally create milestone celebrations, weekly touch points, things that help people feel like we're doing good work and that we matter.
Yeah, absolutely. Many thanks, Trina. Michael, let's maybe come to you. Both Trina and Michele there have mentioned the importance of connection. And I know that this is something you've been tackling both over at Amazon, but also that you uncovered a lot about when you were doing research for your recent book, Adaptive Space. So maybe let's expand a little bit on this idea of connection and why this is such a critical element.
Yeah, I think it's first of all, thrilled to be here, and I'm still stuck on the Dixie cups and string. I'm still trying to figure out like where there's an experiment there, Trina. So maybe we can bring afterwards. Yeah, I mean, I think connections as a whole are essential, obviously, but we got to be more specific than that. And I first of all, I think we're going to look back on this last year as a sort of a disruptive point in the future of work. I believe we will have fast forwarded the future of work 5 to 10 years as a result of this grand experiment we just all went through. I think we're all sort of leaning into a new frontier of work. And I think in many ways, the genie's not going back in the bottle. People like working this way. People like the flexibility, and we learned we can be productive for the most part. But we've also made some pretty significant trade-offs. And I think the type of connection matters. There are really two in science, and I'm a bit of a network geek. So I've been studying this for decade and a half, where I've been looking at network connections, both inside and across organizations. And I think the first thing we've got to describe is there are two really critical types of connections, and both Michele and Trina talked about them both. One is bonding, social capital, and that is how closely connected are you to the people that you work with day to day. The other is bridging social capital, and that is how connected are teams to teams. And it turns out that bonding social capital is held up rather in this virtual environment. Teams have functioned fairly well, although I would say in the early days, they've actually increased the level of connectivity. I would say it's beginning to dissipate over the last 6 months. Fatigue sets in. There's a tax that manager has to pay over time. That exhaustion leaning into the team actually comes at an expense of not leaning into other teams. But it's the bridge connections that I worry most about. We saw like a 30% drop off in the first 4 months of working in this virtual environment, team connected to team. And the reason that's a problem is because that's where ingenuity, serendipity, innovation comes from. That's where culture, tacit learning from a cultural perspective comes. And I think what we're losing is some of those exchanges across teams or across organizations. So I think in the first run of the experiment shows that we can be productive, we can be flexible, people enjoy this environment. I think the next wave of this experiment, whatever it manifests into, will be forcing us to think about the long haul. How do we continue to learn? How do we continue to cultivate and maintain a culture? And then how do we also innovate, most importantly, on an ongoing basis? And I think it's the erosion of the latter that concerns me. So I find myself somewhere in between the 2 points. And I think that there is going to be this agile hybrid that's going to be much more of a form follows function model. When we need to innovate, let's get together face to face. When we need to produce and we're just in execution mode, then I think we can be far more flexible in our work arrangements.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is somewhere that probably most people find themselves now, this kind of somewhere between the two camps. They recognise the benefits of the physical space and the need to get back to the office, but also the real advances that we've made over the course of the past 12 months in terms of embracing different ways of working, virtual and remote being one of those. So I guess, how do we take the elements that are really working in both settings and blend those to this more hybrid approach that I think everybody has been talking about over the past couple of days? What are the critical success factors to get right as you're looking ahead and blending that approach, moving to more of a hybrid model? Michael, I'll come to you first.
Yeah, it starts with intention. What's the purpose? What's the purpose of not just the group, but what's the purpose of the moment? If you're trying to discover, if you're trying to learn, if you're trying to share, That happens best in bridge connections. That happens best whenever you've got some interactions across teams. And what we've seen already is a bit of an erosion in new idea generation already in this short period of time. If you're trying to build, if you're developing, if you're producing, that happens best in a small team. So that could be face to face, or that could be virtual. There are some nuances to that. If it's a wicked problem, if it's a problem that I've never dealt with before, like I want a person next to me who can help me. If it's sort of a reoccurring task, it's easy to do that virtually once you've gotten into the motion. And then the final thing is, how do you scale? How do you take ideas? How do you take learnings, and how do you scale and diffuse them across the broader organization? Once again, that requires bridging connections. And what we've seen is, I mean, early days, you can just read some of the reports. We've seen launch delays. We've seen a lot of product delays as a result of not being able to influence, because those bridging connections were eroded during this period of time. So it started for me, and you could use different nomenclature, but for me, it really depends on, are you trying to learn? Are you trying to build and produce, or are you trying to influence and share? And then you would create a social arrangement or work configuration around that. Some being more face-to-face, some being perfectly fine in a virtual world.
Yeah, really interesting. Thanks, Michael. Michele, let's maybe get some thoughts from you on how that's resonating with you. This idea of, do you see us maybe moving towards a task-based sort of decision-making tree in terms of who does what where versus, just more of a blanket approach? Are we going to have to be much more tailored about this hybrid work model?
I actually do. And, many organizations, including my organization, Sedgwick, we're looking at what does this future of work look like? And we're planning for that. And one of the things that we're doing is we're looking role by role. What does the role entail? And how do we map it to our three personas being in the office full-time, hybrid or agile, or remote full-time? So it really does depend upon the type of work that you're doing. And I want to wrap that all into the employee experience. And I believe that the employee experience has forever changed, and the way that we think about it has forever changed. And when we're thinking about what does the future look like, we have to think about, from the employee's perspective, convenience, functionality, and well-being, and then balance that with what does the organization need? And they're not always going to be in opposition or competing, but sometimes they might be. And so it's incumbent upon us to figure out, how do we make the right trade-offs, and how do we get the right balance to all of that? Knowing that if we can get the experience right, then that's going to drive engagement, which will drive productivity and really positive outcomes.
Yeah, Michele, just I guess a follow-up to that. To what extent does the employee have a say in their preferred mode of working? Because it may be that their role, the tasks that they perform, are actually more suited to one environment than another that maybe doesn't fit with their expectations or their desires.
Yeah, so, and that's tricky. I do think that we have to have a position on the role or the team. And then within that role or within that team, we're going to have to provide some flexibility, but it's not going to be able to be a free-for-all. We've got to manage how we get back into the physical office. And it's not going to be helpful if only part of the team is in, if you need to collaborate for innovation. So we're going to have to be prescriptive, but we're also going to have to give some choice to colleagues, because the labor market is tight. It's only going to get tighter, and we need to be able to compete.
Yeah, really interesting. Thanks, Michele. Trina, I'm going to come to you and get some thoughts from you on what we've heard from both Michael and Michele, but also on this idea of, I guess, whose role is it? HR has a critical role to play in defining what the workplace of the future looks like. But do we need to add this onto their plate as well, in terms of scheduling, where everybody needs to be, whose role does what environment works best? Who actually kind of manages this? I guess this comes back to your earlier point about the importance of the manager across the organization.
Yeah, so many things I want to say with so little time. I'll answer your question directly. It's not just HR anymore, although we as HR professionals know that it falls to us to get the job done a lot of times. I see a very tight partnership between HR, IT, and facilities and real estate in order to really, because the hybrid environment, which is where we're leaning or where most executives are leaning, is the hardest one to get right because you have to coordinate, schedule, and plan so many things, including space now and place and all of those decisions. So I think HR really is the leader just because we tend to step up and do the right thing when it comes to caring for people and strategy. But facilities is a big part of this, and real estate as well as IT. Here's my concern with moving to a hybrid model without full input from all stakeholders, including the front line. You're going to introduce two problems. One is a personal problem. It's the emotional problem of creating second and possibly third class citizens with the fully remote workforce suffering from distance bias. The manager, coming back to your question about the manager, really introduces distance bias, which is a caveman mentality. It's not a conscious thing. We tend to trust and rely on those who are near us. It's a safety feature that we have to become conscious in our brains to override that distance bias. I've, for 35 years, seen virtual employees in hybrid environments suffer career-wise and suffer interpersonally and suffer inclusion and exclusion because out of sight does really mean out of mind. Managers need to be aware of that. Simple training can change that. But I have found a lack of investment in training to prevent these kinds of problems that create bigger culture rifts than anything. Secondly, I'm worried about empty hallways, right? We want the people to come in for innovation and collaboration and creativity, stay home for productivity, transaction, those kinds of things. I think that's a false dichotomy. It's not as easy as all of that. It takes a blend, or what you will have is a whole bunch of empty hallways and byways. People come in for the connection and the inclusion, and they're walking through silent, empty hallways. It's costing the company a lot of money in real estate. So the planning up front of a hybrid environment, while I do agree with all of us on this panel that is the ideal solution, takes more structure, more planning, more prescription in some ways, like Michele said, but we have to be careful not to proscribe so much that we lose people. I was in a meeting last night with an employee who left her company because she moved during COVID for financial purposes to be closer to home and family, and now is being required to come back to the office. She's not moving across the country. She quit her job. So that retention factor is something to consider as we force people to come into the office, at least part-time. It's a huge risk that's not necessary if we just think it through more carefully instead of going for that easy 3 days in the office, 2 days at home kind of split. I hope I answered all of your questions.
Yeah, really interesting, Trina. Many thanks. I did have many questions. I've got many more, and I know we've also got questions coming in from the audience. So, Michael, maybe I'll just get some thoughts on this. Obviously, planning is key, and putting some structure around what that hybrid model looks like. I'll just get some thoughts from you on, I guess, your kind of key recommendations as you're starting to think about this over at Amazon. How are you thinking about structuring this hybrid model? What are the important parts to get right for you? How are you planning to avoid some of those challenges that both Michele and Trina mentioned there?
I guess I would say a couple things, and I agree with all the points that were just made. I don't think you can get too prescriptive on this. I think you got to believe in the power of individuals that provided some degree of guidance. I think I look at this as some degree of flexibility and some degree of intentionality blended together. Intentionality on we've got a purpose to solve for. flexibility, meaning, employees, have some choice. I do believe that many of those choices need to be made at the team level. I completely agree with Michelle's point that like it's useless for an individual to show up if their team is not there. So but I don't believe that you have to prescribe all those. I believe that individuals want to do the right thing. Individuals want to connect with each other. And I think that at the team level and/or group, they'll figure those things out. I think just data matters immensely. Being able to close the loop and share feedback about how you're connected, when you're connected, what you're producing, what you're not producing. I just think that more than ever, I'm very long in the people analytics space in HR, and I really think that perhaps more than ever, the way we connect human beings and the way we share data with them so that they make choices to connect with themselves and others is essential at this point in time. One thing I do want to make one comment, because there's also a real risk here about overconfidence bias, about going fully virtual or mostly virtual. We got to remember one core scientific fact, and that is that most of us went virtual with some degree of social capital already stored up in the bank. In other words, we knew our colleagues, we knew our teammates, and we already get signal today of new employees that joined and have never been face-to-face with teams. They struggle much more than those other folks. So there's some great research that suggests that social capital is very, very difficult to earn and develop virtually. It can happen, but it takes at least 3 to 5 times as many repetitions or interactions. So I just want to mention that one point because I don't think we've called it out yet. This experiment could cause some harm if we're overly confident that we can do this over long haul because we had controlled conditions as we entered into it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Can I jump in with a short statement there, Ben? I agree with what Michael is saying. There's a shift in our intention around trust because trust is the operating system of virtual work, that we start with our trust cup full instead of earning that social capital over time. It's a shift in mindset and intention that makes a big difference when working virtually. And then our behaviors as individual help keep that trust cup full or empty it. And that little shift makes a big difference in being able to develop social capital in a 100% virtual environment, if that's what it ends up being.